Looking at the ancient past from the perspective of modern civilization, which is totally dependent on human-cultivated plants and animals, and knowing what we know now, it is often seen as inevitable that agriculture would win out as the dominant way of life, as either hunter-gatherer groups would have readily adopted it, or have been swiftly pushed to the side by those who did. But the truth may be far more complicated. In reality, thousands of years often passed between when agriculture was first introduced to a region and when it was totally established. While hunter-gatherer societies often held on to their ancestral ways of life and did not quickly let them go. Indeed, there is even strong evidence that farmers eventually adopted cultural elements from their hunter-gatherer neighbors, and may have even become subservient to them in certain cases. This video will look specifically at the fate of the last European hunter-gatherers. In the West Eurasian context, agriculture was invented in the region we now know as the Middle East around 11,000 years ago, with developments in the Levant region of modern Syria, Jordan, Lebanon and Israel, western Iran near the Zagros Mountains, and south-central Anatolia. From this general region, it then radiated outwards into North and East Africa, Central Asia, South Asia, and Europe, which is the focus here. On the eve of the Neolithic transformation, anatomically modern humans had been living in Europe for likely more than 30,000 years, and the continent was already inhabited by diverse societies of hunter-gatherers. Broadly, the people living in Western, Southern, Northern, and Central Europe are known as Western hunter-gatherers. These populations were largely descended from people who had sought refuge in the southern Balkans and Italian peninsula during the period when ice covered much of northern and central Europe, and then repopulated the continent as the ice receded. Meanwhile, so-called Eastern hunter-gatherers, residing in much of what is now European Russia and Ukraine, had a portion of their deep ancestral roots coming from a Siberian population known as ancient North Eurasians. This is all an abstraction, of course, as no one at the time would have identified as either a Western or Eastern hunter-gatherer. Additionally, the reality was far more complicated. For instance, Scandinavian hunter-gatherers and certain others were a mixture of these two groups, and this Eastern European hunter-gatherer ancestry was extant even further west in smaller amounts. It is also important to note that most Western hunter-gatherers, but most prominently individuals from Iberia and southern France, had additional ancestry from a hunter-gatherer population associated with the even earlier Magdalenian culture of Paleolithic reindeer hunters, who were at least partially descended from the first group of people to permanently reside in Europe. A little after 7000 BCE, farmers and herders from what is now Turkey began moving west into Europe. These farmers took two basic routes, through the Balkans into Central Europe, and along the Mediterranean coast to Iberia and Gaul. It is possible this movement was associated with a recent rise in sea levels that may have inundated the coasts and river estuaries where local European hunter-gatherer populations were reliant upon for fishing, and so caused their population to decline. Indeed, it has been established that in the immediately preceding millennia, there was a massive rise in ocean levels, submerging lands where Mesolithic hunter-gatherers had previously made their homes. For example, the area of Doggerland, which connected eastern and southern England to the European continent, was submerged, forming what is now the North Sea, and the Black Sea was created from what had been a lake. Although we can only speculate as to the details, the relatively sudden rise of water likely severely disrupted European hunter-gatherer ways of life, and so left their lands more open to a gradual colonization by farmers from Anatolia. The initial expansion of agriculture outside of its core areas of development was probably not driven by overpopulation as such, in which the farmers exhausted arable land and reached their population ceiling in one area, before some were then forced to move on to the next. Instead, It seems like these incoming farmers effectively leapfrogged ahead, migrating into regions sparsely inhabited by foragers, well before they had reached their population max in the earlier areas of colonization. I personally rather like J.P. Mallory's explanation that the agriculturalists sought to escape the conditions which farming created, but ironically spread them further afield. In this way, they were able to reach the Atlantic coast of Europe, just around 1,000 years after leaving Anatolia en masse. One pressing question is, how did these invading farmers interact with the local hunter-gatherers? And how did the hunter-gatherers react to the introduction of a radically new way of life? Even though their numbers may have been initially relatively small, the Anatolian-derived farmers were able to become a majority in many areas, since their way of life, which consisted of farming and herding, would have been able to support a much larger population density than that of the local foragers. Initially, there seems to have been relatively little interbreeding between the farmers and foragers, as early farmers only had around 5% Western European hunter-gatherer ancestry, and it seems like the agriculturalists set up new societies with minimal interaction with the local foragers, who may have continued to live life as they had done for generations. It is unclear how these groups would have viewed each other and interacted during the following centuries. Although we will probably never know for sure with something that happened so long ago, in historical examples where people with drastically different ways of life encountered each other, they often viewed each other with distrust, if not outright hostility. There is some evidence the same may have been true in Stone Age Europe. For instance, in Neolithic Belgium, there was a no-man's land between the settlements occupied by Anatolian-derived farmers and those of local hunter-gatherers, while in southern France, the severed head of a western hunter-gatherer was found in an agricultural settlement. Likewise, in the mountains of Spain, a massacre of a Neolithic settlement has been found, which might have been carried out by local hunter-gatherers. Such evidence strongly suggests strained relations. Although neither group was anywhere close to united, it's possible that the drastic difference in their ways of life resulted in heightened conflict. We can see this in more recent examples in Africa, in which Bantu pastoralists not infrequently warred with one another, but fought wars of extermination against hunter-gatherer tribes, or in 17th century New England, where the Puritans and their native allies exterminated the Pequot people. Nevertheless, interactions between the two groups eventually became more complex, though still not necessarily peaceful, and we will now look at it region by region in greater detail. Given the geographic proximity of southeastern Europe to Anatolia, it should come as no surprise that the Balkans were the first region of Europe to be colonized by Anatolian farmers, and so it was the first region we see any interaction between Aegean farmers and Mesolithic European hunter-gatherers. Initially, there seems to have been relatively little interaction between the colonizing farmers and local Mesolithic foragers, as there was a 95% homogeneity of the Aegean Anatolian-derived farmers, indicating only minimal and sporadic introgression between the two groups, or that there were so few local hunter-gatherers that they were assimilated into the much larger group of agriculturalists relatively early on. Although by and large, agriculture was spread by the steady northward and westward march of Anatolian-derived farmers, there is strong evidence that local Balkan foragers sporadically adapted elements of the Neolithic lifestyle. For instance, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers at the site of Lipinski Vir in modern Serbia had a more sedentary way of life than we typically associate with foragers, living in more permanent settlements and carving distinctive anthropomorphic fish statues that remain as relics of their distinctive, now lost culture. It is unclear to what extent this represents a significant adaptation of farming by local Mesolithic people, or if it was essentially an experimental dead end. Though initially the two groups remained relatively separate from each other, eventually the farmers absorbed significant local hunter-gatherer ancestry in the Balkans, reflecting its place as a crossroads between Eastern and Western Europe. There was introgression of both Eastern and Western European hunter-gatherer ancestry into the Aegean or Anatolian-derived farmers. That there was an increase in this hunter-gatherer ancestry during the later Neolithic indicates that the two genetically distinct groups eventually merged or at least intermingled. In addition to the spread of genetics, there was also a spread of cultural elements. For instance, the adoption of extended supine burials in Neolithic communities suggests Mesolithic forager influence, if not dominance, since that was part of their tradition, not an Anatolian farmer tradition. At roughly around 4,500 BCE, the amount of hunter-gatherer ancestry all across European farmer societies considerably increased, going up from just around 5% to sometimes a quarter or more. For example, some German samples had roughly 40% European hunter-gatherer ancestry and showed a mix of Mesolithic and Neolithic lifestyles, as indicated by their diets. Similarly, Ballynahati woman, a Neolithic Irish woman, had roughly around 40% Western European hunter-gatherer ancestry, likely a result of a major mixing event that had previously taken place in northwestern Europe. In Neolithic Poland as well, only around 30% of the overall ancestry was from European hunter-gatherers, but all of the male lineages were. This increase was probably a result of similar situations across Europe, instead of one hunter-gatherer tribe simply conquering everyone, since in Iberia and France, we also see significant introgression of the older Magdalenian-associated ancestry into Neolithic farmers, and there the population was modeled as a mixture of Anatolian-derived farmers with the two distinct European hunter-gatherer lineages. Likewise, in Eastern Europe, around Romania and Ukraine, associated with the Cucutini-Tripilia culture, we see an increase of local Eastern European hunter-gatherer ancestry. It was not an even mix, however, as this increase in hunter-gatherer ancestry seems to have been male-dominated. For instance, the male ancestry of the mid to late Neolithic British and Irish farmers was 100% Western European hunter-gatherer, though the slight majority of their overall ancestry was still Anatolian farmer-derived. Although not quite as drastic, the Western European hunter-gatherer resurgence was also noticeable in southern Europe. In Neolithic Sardinia, for example, although the majority of their ancestry was of Anatolian farmer descent, around half of Y haplogroups were associated with the older Western European hunter-gatherer male lineages. This could indicate an elite who were of European hunter-gatherer ancestry. Likewise, in Iberia, after the initial Anatolian farmer colonization, introgression from local hunter-gatherers gradually went up and increased from around a fifth to a quarter, which once again had disproportionately male ancestry coming from the hunter-gatherers. In Neolithic France, male line ancestry was disproportionately the hunter-gatherer haplogroup I2, but the female ancestries were a much more eclectic and diverse mix, suggesting a handful of European hunter-gatherer lineages dominated. It is very likely that the hunter-gatherers were the conquerors who effectively took over their farmer neighbors, or at least became their cultural elites, because in addition to the general increase in hunter-gatherer ancestry, the disproportionately male ancestry, cultural traits such as uniquely Mesolithic burial styles started to appear in Neolithic graves, which strongly suggests that it was the local foragers who actually had the upper hand. There is more to the saga of the last European hunter-gatherers, and I will briefly go over it before getting to the conclusion. It's worth saying that there was no Western European hunter-gatherer resurgence in Greece, as the local European hunter-gatherer population was the closest to Anatolia and likely simply absorbed by the incoming farmers. There was, however, an increase in Caucasian hunter-gatherer ancestry during roughly the same time. This ancestry also appeared in Sicily, Sardinia, and southern Italy, which to me at least indicates it was likely a naval-based expansion. Ultimately, I think this demonstrates the stronger connection of Greece and even parts of Italy to the civilized Eastern Mediterranean world. After the Western European hunter-gatherer resurgence occurred, there was a second phase of farmer expansion in Europe, in which the now Western hunter-gatherer enriched farmers grew internally and also expanded into the British Isles and Scandinavia. Eventually, all of Britain and Ireland were completely colonized, but in Scandinavia, the farmers could not advance further than southern Sweden, and here, unlike in most of the rest of Europe, hunter-gatherers remained, subsisting heavily on maritime resources. In the early 3rd millennium BCE, these hunter-gatherers of the Scandinavian pitted ware culture seemingly expelled the encroaching farmers from southern Sweden and Denmark. And the fact that northern European farmers built palisaded settlements suggests that they may have come under attack from their hunter-gatherer neighbors. Likewise, European hunter-gatherers persisted in the Baltic region of modern Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Kaliningrad, and northern Poland. Like in Scandinavia, the harsh, inhospitable environment likely prevented the establishment of farming on a wide scale, and local hunter-gatherers continued their traditional ways of life. Though unlike in Scandinavia, these Baltic hunter-gatherers were mostly of the Western European lineage, with relatively little ancestry coming from the Siberian or Eastern European type. Indeed, even today, Baltic peoples generally have the most Western European hunter-gatherer ancestry of any population. In both the Eastern Baltic and in Scandinavia, the hunting and gathering way of life would only come to an end when the inhabitants of these regions were conquered or displaced by invading steppe pastoralists in the early to mid 3rd millennium BCE. This may not have been the complete end of northern European hunter-gatherers, though, as the survival of Y haplogroup I1 potentially indicates that some local men were assimilated into the invading population and continued to spread their genetics. In summary, in the later Neolithic, during the period from roughly 1,000 years after the initial Anatolian colonization of Europe to the arrival of Indo European steppe pastoralists, native European hunter-gatherers seem to have gained ascendancy over the incoming Anatolian farmers. This is evident from the replacement of Anatolian farmer male lineages and the widespread adoption of Mesolithic cultural traits such as burial customs in Neolithic societies. Also, even long after the introduction of agriculture, not all hunter-gatherers were compelled to give up their ancestral way of life. For instance, as late as 3200 BCE, on the cusp of the European Bronze Age, in northern Germany, at least, there were still unmixed hunter-gatherers, likely living as their ancestors had done for generations before them, persisting long after farmers had become demographically dominant. Although we will probably never know for sure, there are a few probable explanations as to why this all occurred. First is the mostly peaceful scenario. Under this paradigm, Anatolian farmer women preferred hunter-gatherer men as mates, perhaps due to their superior height, better diet, and overall better health, and even perhaps their exotic blue eyes. Since these Anatolian farmers may have struggled to adapt to new environments in Western Europe, the local hunter-gatherers, who had already been living there for millennia, could have provided valuable assistance. For instance, in times of poor harvest or other difficulties, farming communities might have welcomed the hunter-gatherers, who would have provided useful skills such as knowledge of fishing, gathering nuts, and hunting. Because of this, families might have preferred hunter-gatherer mates for their daughters, and over time, male hunter-gatherer lineages predominated due to sexual selection. The other scenario is much darker, but vindicated by countless examples from human history and even the animal kingdom, as the Anatolian-derived farmers struggled and may have suffered some form of societal collapse. The hunter-gatherers actually took them over through violent conquest. This would explain the overall increase in hunter-gatherer ancestry and why it tended to skew male, as bands of warriors effectively killed or excluded the men and mated with the women. Under both scenarios, it is probable that being larger and more complex, farmer societies were more vulnerable to instability. This resulted in hunter-gatherer populations gaining more influence in them before they finally turned to agriculture as well, perhaps adopting elements of the Neolithic package piecemeal during their extended interactions with the new farmers. Regardless of how it happened exactly, the result was the creation of hybrid societies, which would prove highly successful and innovative. In addition to finally expanding into the far reaches of Northern Europe, they developed a refined and exquisite artistic cultural tradition, which reached its apogee in megalith building, the creation of tombs, standing stones, and other stone structures that can still be seen today. Indeed, it has even been suggested that these now famous megaliths were actually an evolution from previous Mesolithic customs. Clearly, it was not as simple as the more advanced and numerous Anatolian farmers simply displacing or absorbing the local European hunter-gatherers. This is what I expected to find before doing more research, as our own more recent history is rife with examples of so-called primitive peoples being colonized or replaced. The truth, however, seems to be far more complex and interesting, as it appears that Anatolian-derived farmers lived side by side with the native European hunter-gatherers, intermingling relatively minimally, until eventually, at least in some areas, the hunter-gatherers actually gained a dominant position in these societies, and may have effectively taken the farmers over, although the precise details and mechanism for how this happened is still not clear. To use a more modern example, this would be like if hundreds of years after the initial British colonization of Australia, the local Aborigines had actually conquered or otherwise become rulers of Perth, Melbourne, and Sydney. The wider takeaway from all this is that agriculture was not simply an obviously superior way of life that people eagerly and quickly adopted, and that many populations were slow to give up their ancestral way of living. In addition, although the details may never be clear, there is undeniable evidence that the hunter-gatherers somehow dominated, or at least became very important within agricultural societies. Lastly, although I will not have time to go into detail on it here, I think this holds true from a global perspective as well. For instance, although modern-day Tibetans and Japanese get the majority of their ancestry from mainland Asian farmers, with only around a third to a fifth, respectively, coming from the indigenous hunter-gatherer populations of those areas. Both populations' male line ancestry is disproportionately from those hunter-gatherers, as evident from the continued preponderance of Y haplogroup D. Likewise, in the American Southwest, it appears that the more nomadic hunter-gatherer populations, such as Numic and Navajo speakers, eventually triumphed over the more sedentary, advanced farmers associated with ancestral Puebloan cultures, displacing or conquering them, which may have resulted in the creation of modern ethnic groups such as the Hopi. Ultimately, it goes to show that there is not a simple or teleological transition from one way of life to another, yet an inverse. Being taller, healthier, and more sexually desirable was no guarantee that one's way of life would win out, and that the race is not necessarily to the swift nor the battle to the strong, and masses of malnourished dwarves may eventually become demographically dominant purely in virtue of being able to outbreed their neighbors.